Hey everyone, welcome to the Lewis Lee podcast. This is Lewis Lee. This episode is part 4 of a series of podcasts that I've done reviewing a book that I've read and that I've seen have an immense impact on my life, Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And this week's episode starts off at rule number 9. But before we jump into rule number 9, if this is the first episode you've come across, first off, thank you for listening. I appreciate the time. But also make sure that before you continue with this podcast, please check out the first 3 parts to this series. Episode 97, episode 104, and episode 109 are parts 1 through 3. So please check them out and then come back to episode 110, part 4, which starts at rule number 9, which is assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. This chapter, this rule, if you will, is about listening. And as a communications professional, I spent 4 years in sales and now I've spent 3 years in marketing. The biggest thing that I've realized, the biggest skill set to have is the ability to listen. The ability to listen is difficult on multiple reasons. But the thing that I can point to the most is being able to get out of your own way and open up your mind and your heart to the incoming information that is someone else who's telling you to do something. I can remember when I worked as a laborer for my uncle's masonry company when I was 16, and I had screwed up a project, and this was a habitual pattern of me, one mistake after another, messing something up, and my uncle called me out on it at the site, and he told me that I needed to do a better job listening, and he looked at my face and he could see the wheels in my own mind turning. And he said that right now, in that moment, he called me out on thinking about how I was going to respond rather than thinking about what he was saying to me. I wasn't paying attention. I was listening to respond rather than listening to understand. And that rule for me, not only as a communication professional, but also just as a person, as a friend, as a family member, as a husband, it's been one of the most difficult things for me to practice. And I think that's the biggest thing to point out, is that this is a practice. Listening is a practice. It's nothing that you'll get to the point where you could say, I have now reached the point where I'm the greatest listener that has ever existed and there's no more work for me to do. It's certainly a practice, and we'll touch on this a little bit later. It's similar to a meditation practice, something that can bring you to the present moment, and it's something that you have to exercise time in and time again. Another example for listening for me comes to networking. When I was selling insurance, networking was a huge part of that, and being able to connect with others and potentially uncover opportunities to collaborate with other sales professionals. It forced me to go to mixers. And mixers are kind of weird because you're going to meet a bunch of people that you don't know. But then other than that, it's a different vibe than when you're going to a bar to hang out with people, or you're going to some type of like sporting event or entertainment event, because it's like you understand that you're going there to figure out how you can grow your business, and you understand that everyone else has that same intention. So there's a little bit of awkwardness of like, what is this person up to when you meet them? But nonetheless, networking has been important to my life. I feel like it's led to anything that has been productive for me professionally, in getting to learn how to meet new people and foster a meaningful and professional relationship is an essential skill that I recommend to everyone, especially young professionals coming out of college. It's helped me tremendously. And the biggest thing that's helped me when I go to network is to get out of my own way. And like when I get out of my own way, I'm doing that for the sake of the other person. It's like when I would go to these networking events, I would make it all about the people that I interact with. And that took so much pressure off me. I didn't have to go in and worry about how I was being perceived, because I was spending so much more energy and attention and focus on giving attention to other people and learning about who they were and what they were about and what their goals were. Changing my focus outward instead of inward gave me a relief of anxiety that allowed me to better listen. And one of the things that I always did was I would always I would introduce myself. Hi, my name's Lewis, and they would introduce themselves as well. And I would never bring up what I did. I would always ask them, so what is it that you do? Or how do you do what you do? Or how's business going? And what is your business? I'd always ask them and try to dig into who they were first. And I would go on the offensive. And that would give me the ability to relax and open myself up to learning something new. And I would never tell them what I did unless they asked me. And I did this for two reasons. One, I didn't want to be salesy. I didn't want to give sales pitch to other people. And two, I feel like for better or worse, if the other person asked me what I did or wanted to show interest in me, then that was a good sign that this is someone who's potentially an ally with what I'm trying to do as a business professional. And if they weren't interested in me, and if they didn't happen to take the time to say, hey, what are you about? I want to learn about you. That was also telling. It also told me that this is a person that isn't that aware or conscious or considerate of other people. And potentially, if they behaved like that, then maybe they weren't someone who was going to make for a good partner in the long term. So I always made it about the other person, and I always tried to take responsibility of the engagement and go on the offense first. And I found that has been a productive way to position myself to listen better and to also learn instead of kind of promote my own agenda. And that has been very helpful to me. So going to the book, Peterson talks about how listening it's more of something that's being done to you than you doing something to it. and it's this idea that it's kind of like a tennis match. You kind of go back and forth with each other. The book says that first, as I said, I put myself in the proper frame of mind. I aim properly. I want things to be better. My mind orients itself given this goal. It tries to produce responses to the therapeutic dialogue, and he's talking about how he listens in his clinical psychology method. So he says that it tries to produce responses to the therapeutic dialogue that furthers the aim. I watch what happens internally. I reveal my responses. So, and this kind of goes against what I said earlier about responding versus understanding. But when you're truly listening and you're engaging and you're sending the tennis ball, if you will, back to the other person, it's more so revealing what has what that other person said, what it brought to your mind. And that's an observation. That's a meditation. It's observing what comes to mind and then trying to clearly articulate that as best you can to the other person. In the book, Peterson gives an example. He says, I say, you said this, and I noticed that I became aware of this. Then we discuss it. We try to determine the relevance of meaning of my reaction. So it's almost as if you're learning in real time. What's happening? What are you feeling? What are you visualizing when the other person says XYZ? That's information that can be useful for both of you in the conversation, and it allows you to push the ball forward for both of you. There's a saying there, a popular interviewer whose name I cannot think of right now, I apologize, but he said that as an interviewer, the rule that he follows the most is that he's never learned anything when he was the one doing the talking. And that's such a profound statement. When we're in a conversation, when we're in a dialogue, and we try to get our points across, those are already points that we have developed and that we have learned and that we have understood. And because of that, when you are responding in a way that is observational, observing how you're reacting to what the other person says, it gives you a chance to uncover what you're learning in real time. And I think that helps the other person, and it helps the conversation go back and forth in a productive manner. Back to the book. He says that's the key to psychotherapeutic process. Two people tell each other the truth and both listen. And I just made a note here that this is a great goal for marriage. The idea, or any relationship of that, it's like the idea is you both want to grow, you both want to make things better. And the only way that you can do that is observe how you're responding to incoming information in a way that is accurate and truthful. And if everyone does that, the only way forward is progress, and it's very powerful. And going back to the book, Jordan Peterson points out a clinical psychologist of the name Carl Rogers. He pulls a quote from Carl Rogers regarding how one should listen. It says here, the great majority of us cannot listen. We find ourselves compelled to evaluate because listening is too dangerous. The first requirement is courage, and we do not always have it. And to me, this points out that when you truly listen, you're paying attention to the inherent fact that your consciousness is awareness itself, and it's not your job to dictate what is inevitably it is not your job to dictate what inevitably pops up inside of you during a dialogue, but rather observe and appropriately articulate what's coming about with a productive intent. So you're going to realize that when you start listening to other people, you might have some hesitation to just be able to sit back and observe how your mind is responding to that information. You might want to jump and insert your own projections into the conversation because you feel like that that would make you more adequate. Being able to give your own projections in there is what makes you feel like you're not in a void or you're not clueless. I feel like when I take a step back and I say to myself, I'm going to listen to whatever this person is going to say to me, I feel kind of vulnerable because I don't know how I'm going to respond to that. But that tension is what is used as a practice to kind of observe how you're responding to that and what's coming, what thoughts or what opinions are coming up as a result, and being able to observe that in a way that is clear and articulate and present that back to the other person is a lot more productive than just going over what you already know and what concrete ideas that you've made about the world. Being able to in real time present something that's unique and relevant is a lot more beneficial as a result. The last thing that I would like to point out when it comes to listening is one of the best advice that I got from listening comes from a psychologist and Buddhist instructor, Tara Brach. She said that when you're listening to someone else, pay attention to your body, pay attention to the physical sensations that you're receiving when you're engaging with that other person. Do you feel a sense of anxiety rising up within you? Do you feel restless? Do you feel like you want to move away from the conversation instead of move forward into it? Do you find yourself not being able to look the person in the eye? All of those things are observations that give you an idea of what's going on and how you're engaging with the other person. And it's very telling because what I've started to realize when I'm paying attention to not only how my mind is engaging with what's being presented to me, but how my body is engaging with the other person. A lot of times I realize that, one, I'm not paying it as much attention as I possibly could, but then two, there's like a lot of nervousness and there's a lot of a sense of me trying to close in and get smaller and protect myself. And it's always interesting to think, why is this the case? Why is this happening? And how can I open myself up a little bit more? So when it comes to listening, it's this idea of being able to observe rather than to react, and speaking as articulately and as clearly and as truthfully as you can to the other person, so that way you had this dialogue where both of you are transforming each other as a result. Rule 10, be precise in your speech. And I wrote down about yourself and about others. And this makes me think of a time that I bombed on stage one night at the Funny Stop. And I said, I love this. I love bombing on stage in effort to make fun of myself and to get a laugh. And obviously that didn't work. I got off stage and a fellow comedian came up to me and said, never say that again. You never tell the audience that you're bombing. And it was, when I look back at it, it was a cheap move. It was one where I was seeking reassurance with a quick laugh. And the point is, I went up on stage to make people laugh, and they didn't. And to make matters worse, I pointed out that this was the case. And it reminds me of when I used to play basketball, and after making a mistake, I would often say, "My bad." And I said it so much that my coach stopped practice one day, and he told me, "Stop saying my bad. We know you're bad. We all saw it. Just move on." And that goes for mistakes we make on and off the court. It's like you don't have to pronounce your shortcomings to the world. And I feel like most times when I do that, I'm doing that with the hopes that someone else responds, "Oh, it's okay," or "Oh, it's not your fault," or whatever. It's wasted energy, and it's not making you any stronger. Now, yes, you could say it to yourself, but say it to yourself in a way that's productive. There's To be honest with yourself is one thing, but to tear yourself down repeatedly becomes counterproductive. So for me, that's being precise with my speech, being precise of what I mean, and I think this also goes for being precise in what you don't understand. If you don't understand something, to me, one of the biggest things that I'm struggling with is saying, "I don't understand XYZ," or "Could you please explain to me ABC?" It's this idea of being precise on what's going on and being real with yourself, so that way you can move forward and become better as a result. And being precise in your speech, it kind of it allows you to fix things sooner rather than later. And when you're not being precise with your speech, obviously with yourself, but in the case of working with other people or the relationships you have, you're kind of just kicking the can down the street and sweeping things under the rug and hoping that somehow, some way things will get better. But we all know that speaking the truth and being precise and being transparent and being willing and able to take responsibility and accountability up front, that gives us the best chance to fix things and fix things before they get worse, and which they inevitably do. And that brings me to this next point, quoting in the book. It says, "Chaos emerges in a household bit by bit. Mutual unhappiness and resentment pile up. Everything untidy is swept under the rug, where the dragon feasts on the crumbs. But no one says anything, as the shared society and negotiated order of the household reveals itself as inadequate, or disintegrates in the face of the unexpected and threatening. Everybody whistles in the dark instead. Communication would require admission of terrible emotions: resentment, terror, loneliness, despair, jealousy, frustration, hatred, boredom. Moment by moment, it's easier to keep the peace. But in the background, in Billy Bixby's house and all that are like it, the dragon grows. One day it bursts forth in a form that no one can ignore. It lifts the very household from its foundations. Then it's an affair, or a decade-long custody dispute of ruinous economic and psychological proportions. Then it's the concentrated version of the acrimony that could have been spread out tolerably, issue by issue, over the years of the pseudo-paradise of the marriage. Everyone of the 300,000 unrevealed issues which have been lied about, avoided, rationalized away, hidden like an army of skeletons in some great horrific closet, burst forth like Noah's flood, drowning everything. There's no ark because no one built one, even though everyone felt the storm gathering. And that is an extreme example of how not being honest with yourself and not being honest with others and not being precise on what's happening. This is an extreme example of how things kind of build up over time, and then they collapse under the pressure that is built from all the stuff that was swept underneath the rug. And it makes me think of a situation where I was explaining something to my wife who misunderstood what I was telling her, and I gave her a confused face that was, to be honest, it was insulting, and she called me out on it and told me that when I make that face when she doesn't understand something, that I was being rude to her. And she was right. So I apologized, and I told her that I'd do a better job moving forward. And she told me it's okay. But I told her that it wasn't. I said, no, it's not okay. And making a face at your spouse seems minimal on the surface, but we plan on looking at each other's faces for a long time to come. So I'm glad she called me out on something that wasn't okay now, so that way we wouldn't spend the next 5 decades with me being rude and making her feel bad as a result. So if you don't like something, no matter how minimal it is, say something, speak up, or else plan to deal with it for the rest of your life. And is that something that you can deal with? I mean, are you going to let things roll off your back? I guess the criteria in that situation is, if you're willing to let it roll off your back, then you should be willing to deal with it for the rest of your life. And so if it meets that criteria, then let it go. But if you can't see yourself putting up with XYZ for decades to come, then mention that, bring that up, give the other person the respect that you deserve and that they deserve to work it out right then and there before it becomes worse. Going back to the book, says, say what you mean so that way you can find out what you mean. Act out what you say so you can find out what happens. Then pay attention. Note your errors, articulate them, strive to correct them. That is how you discover the meaning of your life. That will protect you from the tragedy of your life. How could it be otherwise? And this is specifically on being honest with yourself, right? If you're honest with yourself, then the things that you say to other people or the things that you believe in, when you act them out in a way, it makes them that more true. And of course, we're all going to make mistakes along the way, but that's why paying attention is so crucial. So you can note the mistakes and then also articulate how you're going to avoid them moving forward. To me, this screams my amateur stand-up comedy career, because every set that I do, I understand that after that set, there's always going to be room for improvement. The continuous improvement of my act is as real as anything else could be real. I could always become funnier. I can always engage with the crowd better. I can always be more prepared. I can always be more aware of how my jokes are being perceived by other people. And that's a microcosm of life itself. It's a little example of how you can go up there with a plan. And in my case, it's a set, right? There's a set of jokes that I plan on telling the audience. And then you put that out into the world and you pay attention and you respond accordingly. Was it good? Was it bad? What am I going to do moving forward to fix it? Back to the book. Rule number 11. Do not bother children when they are skateboarding. And to sum up this chapter, it comes down to, for those of you who have children, I do not have children, so please let me know what you think about this chapter. But it's the idea of, are you hurting your children when you're helping them? And to me, it's that balance of being able to nurture other people and even nurture yourself. But when does it come up that you're enabling someone and not pushing them to their fullest? We all understand that we can do better. We all understand that we have potential. So with that being the case, how do you point to someone and say, you can be better, you can do better, you can be more? How do you do that in a way that's non-insulting? It's a balance, right? Because Jordan Peterson talks about this often, where there's this idea of us telling our youth, us telling young people, you're okay with the way you are. But how do you balance that with potential? Because can you come to someone and say, hey, you're insuffice, you're insufficient, you have things to work on? And of course, I mean this, saying this to children, and then also saying this to yourself. But it's like, you're not okay with the way you are, and you need to get better. But the good news is, you're 18 years old and you have the next 60 years to do so. So you have a lot of time to get better, but you're not going to get better if you think that everything's okay right now, and that you think that you're okay as you are. Because if you truly believe that and you truly act that out, then what you do is you end up leaving transformation out of it. And that's where growth is. That's where growth comes from. I can remember having this conversation with Raven, I think it was like several months ago on the podcast, where I asked her, have you ever grown without becoming uncomfortable? And the answer was no. And the answer is also no for myself. I can't think of a time where I've gotten better where I didn't have to go through some level of tension. And to me, that is transformation. That is giving up what you were, so that way you can become something better on the other end. And Peterson talks about how bothering kids who are skateboarding, and to make it more general, more broad, bothering kids that potentially on the surface seems to be dangerous, you could be hurting them. There's a risk. There's always a risk. There's a risk in there's a risk that when you have a child, that the tragedies of life and the bad things in the world are going to happen to them. But there's also a risk of keeping them in the basement, locked up, and not having a reason to transform themselves and to contribute and to grow and to build as a result. So there's risks on both sides. And I guess you have to weigh out the two of them. And this comes from stress, right? I mean, there's a book that I want to read called Antifragile, and it's the idea that humans are the exact opposite of being fragile. That humans, when we are in intense, difficult situations, it forces us to grow as a result. I know that I mentioned this in the last episode, but when you go on the offense and you voluntarily take on the uncertainties of the world, Peterson says that you use a whole different you use a whole different circuitry that puts you on the offense. Whereas when you stand back and you're uncertain about things and you allow that uncertainty and that anxiety to keep you from doing things, you actually use a prey circuitry where you feel like you're an animal that's being chased, and that's where anxiety comes from. But flipping that, being able to voluntarily take on life's uncertainties and the things that you're afraid of, leaning into the tension and taking on that stress, it requires you to become a different person as a result, and overprotection threatens that. So going back to the book, Peterson talks about some philosophers and their thoughts on coddling young children, and of course this could go coddling ourselves as a result. But the book says, for Newman and for Young, consciousness struggles upward towards the light. Its development is painful and anxiety-provoking as it carries with the realization of vulnerability and death. It is constantly tempted to sink back down into dependency and unconsciousness, and to shed its existential burden. It is aided in the pathological desire by anything that opposes enlightenment, articulation, rationality, self-determination, strength, competence, by anything that shelters too much, and therefore smothers and devours. Such overprotection is Freud's Oedipal familial nightmare, which we are rapidly transforming into social policy. And I believe Peterson, from a Canadian perspective, is talking more so on, it was like Bill 16 or something like that, where it was putting things into law where you had to call people certain gender pronouns, and if you didn't, then you were committing a crime. And as a result, it was almost as if they're positioning it as if you're protecting the safety of individuals by what other people say. And that level of overprotection is overt to the extent where you're actually hurting other people rather than helping them. And of course, I believe we should treat people with respect, and we should say kind words to people. I don't believe that we should beat other people up verbally, but I also believe in free speech, and I don't think that you can live in a world where free speech exists but hate speech doesn't. And that's what it comes down to. It's like, let's give people enough dignity to understand that, hey, people may say bad things about you or to you, but I believe that you're stronger than that, and that you can persist in the face of that. And it makes me think of how pressure requires people to build and become stronger. And it makes me think of an example of competition in business. And most people think that competition is bad. And from a sales perspective, from a sales and marketing perspective, I see a lot of people bashing the competition and trying to win business that way by positioning them in a way that makes them seem better. But I came across a book I read, Made in America by Sam Walton, where the first page he opens up thanking his competitors, thanking Kmart, JCPenney's, and Sears for what they've done. And he said if it wasn't for them, he would have not had the incentive to get better and to grow. And I found that so interesting, and I found it so beautiful. It's because he took something that usually people look at as an annoyance, something that is in the way, something that is a wall between them and progress, and he just literally took a hammer and smashed that wall down, and he thanked it as a result for making him stronger and giving him an incentive to work harder. And to me, that's what happens when we don't over protect people, when we give them the benefit of the doubt that yes, they have a lot of work to do to get better, but they will get better. And they're going to get better as a result of stress and not collapse in the face of it. Rule number 12, pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. And right after I finished this book and I read this rule, I was in a wedding of a friend of mine. And at the reception, I left to get some fresh air. It was a reception in the countryside of Pennsylvania, and I walked over to a picnic table, and lo and behold, there was a black cat. And I was nervous. I normally don't see stray cats, and I was kind of nervous of like what's going on. You never know what a cat is going to do. You never know if they're going to be friendly or they're going to attack you. And this is what Peterson paints the picture of cats. He says that dogs are a lot more accepting. They're a lot more loving, if you will. And of course, there's dangerous dogs that have attacked people, but generally dogs are domestic dogs are very harmless, and they're companions with humans, and they're loving. Whereas cats, it's kind of 50-50. It's kind of up in the air. It's kind of, they have to make the decision to be nice to you. And in a roundabout way, he kind of likens that to nature itself, or just life in general, of just being itself. There's no guarantee that the world or that life is going to treat you in a way that you deem to be nice. It might bite you. It might let you enjoy it by being nurturing to you. But nonetheless, when you see a cat, take that risk. Be able to call a cat over and see what's it going to do. It might just totally ignore you. It probably will. But in the scenario of when I ran into a black cat, it came up to me and it sat with me and it rubbed itself against me and it showed me love. And I think that we need to take advantage of each and every moment that we get that is similar to that. Whether it's an actual cat showing you love or a metaphoric cat showing you love. Life itself being nurturing to you. Accept it. Be thankful for it and embrace it, because for what we know, this is all we have. And each moment of gratefulness and each moment of thankfulness and gratitude and nurturing should be accepted, because it's a beautiful thing and it's not promised. So when it's presented to us, let's take advantage by it, by enjoying it. And I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope you enjoyed the series. I appreciate you. If you've listened to all 4 of them and you're listening to this now, I appreciate you being patient with me as I stumble over these concepts, but they've been very impactful for me, and I hope that some of the ideas and concepts that Jordan Peterson presented to you through these podcasts stick out. And I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear any feedback, if you have it, on what you think about this episode, what you think about the podcast, what your thoughts are in general. I'd love to hear from you. Reach out to me on Twitter, where I'm at _Lewis_Lee. Thank you so much for the work you do, and thanks again for listening. Have a great week.